Hello, and thanks for tuning into Ukraine Update from M Compass Media. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. Every week I'm joined by John Moran, a foreign affairs journalist, who'll give us an update on what's happening in the NATO Ukraine-Russia war. John, thanks for joining us today.
Hello, Finbar. Got a busy enough week this week, and things are changing. One of the important things that I notice is changing, which is very relevant, is that the mainstream media in the West appears to be catching up a little bit on the reality of what's going on in Ukraine, and particularly with the astronomical losses that are being suffered by the Ukrainians and not just in Bakhmut, but in other places as well. For example, in Crimea, to the north of Donbass, you have 11,000 plus casualties. That's dead for February alone. I mean, that's a very sobering figure. 11,000 young men and boys have died in a month. And it's only hotting up.
And that's just one area, isn't it, John?
That's just in Bakhmut. And as I say, in Crimea, the rates of losses for Ukrainians is even higher because it's more open ground and they're fighting in forests and all sorts of things. So while the front lines have remained more or less intact, with the exception of Bakhmut, which is now in a pincer movement, but it's not fully enclosed yet, nor do I think the Russians want to fully enclose it. They never do. That's the way they always operate. They did the same in Syria. They would leave a horseshoe shape to allow people to leave if they wanted to. So it's a useful way of avoiding massive losses in the end stage of a battle, having achieved your objective. So with those massive losses, they are now beginning to be noticed in the West. And that, along with the fact that all these weapons that were promised to Ukraine, it looks like every country is looking for a reason not to send them because it's just delay after delay after delay. And I have a feeling, and I hope I'm right, that maybe the West thinks enough is enough. Enough Ukrainians have died for this. And if ever there was time for peace protests, it is now. 11,000 lads in February, 11,000 mothers on International Women's Day today will be crying their eyes out in Ukraine because we are giving them all these weapons and all this assistance. All those men would be alive if we hadn't gotten involved. And if Ireland hadn't been so enthusiastically dragged along with the whole thing. But enough is enough, as I say, and I think it's time for protests. They're happening all over Europe. They're happening in the United States. This is only the start, and I think we have to stop this monstrosity before it ends.
We've had a couple of demonstrations here in Ireland, and they do seem to be increasing in attendance numbers for every demonstration that we do have. John, in terms of Bakhmut itself right now, there's been a lot happening over the last week. Have you any updates?
There's a lot going on there. The Russians, or should I say the musicians of the Wagner group, have completely surrounded, with a small exception of that space in the middle. But they on their own have taken on the finest troops that Ukraine has, and they have reached this stage. And what you have there, what you see, is an enormous trap that Ukraine has fallen into. My belief, it has fallen into that because Vladimir Zelensky decided to make a last stand, Zelensky's last stand in Bakhmut. You recall when he went over to address a joint meeting of the American Congress, and he brought a flag from the Bakhmut soldiers, which was signed by a lot of them, and he held it up in the US Parliament to show to the world. So he is very connected to Bakhmut. But the truth of the situation is coming out as well, because he also admitted, finally, that if Bakhmut falls, the road is open to the west of Ukraine. You have a couple of cities that he has to take yet, which will be taken, and not with the same difficulty that Bakhmut was taken. But we're at the stage now where massive losses are taking place in Ugledar, in Crimea, in Bakhmut, in those three, and Liman. There are heavy losses there as well. So at a stage where we can see that the Ukrainian army cannot match the Russian army, and that we are only sending thousands and thousands of young men and boys to their death here. For what? You know?
We have video footage here, John, of some of the road, the only road left out of Bakhmut, and the retreat from Bakhmut. So we're just going to show these two videos. The second video actually has some Ukrainian soldiers who appear to be very upset, and some of them crying as they're trying to drag their heavy mud-laden boots along that road out of Bakhmut, or Artemovsk as it's called by the Russians. We'll just have a look at these two videos, John, and we'll come back and
Sure.
Ай, блядь, сука, нахуй, блядь. Ёбаный, блядь, своими, блядь, хуйню, блядь, довели, блядь. Я должен тут, блядь, пиздовать, блядь.
So this is the road out of Bakhmut. These are men who came here to fight. They were told that they were fighting for a particular cause. You may agree or disagree with it, but there's no doubt that they've been through hell and back over the last few weeks and months in Bakhmut. What's your take on those videos, John?
Oh, it's not only those, but I've seen some videos about the young lads they're bringing in and going straight into the trenches. Of their first encounter with contact is going to be in the trenches. Now, you'd need to know, first of all, the noise that you'll be surrounded by, the fear that you're surrounded by, because these guys are just ordinary human beings. They're scared shitless because any little strip of metal from any of the bombs that are exploding all over the place, that are bouncing all over the front line, could kill them. One guy talked about bringing 6 guys who'd never fought before to the trench. 3 of them survived the night, 24 hours. This is what we're seeing, and lads who are being dragged off the street to fight in these, what they themselves call hell. This is outrageous, and this is happening in Europe.
And Ukraine is reported to be recruiting 16 to 60-year-olds. And I've seen some videos which look like some of the soldiers were even less than 16. So they're putting children and older people up there to be blown apart with no military experience whatsoever, maybe a few weeks training, if you want to call it that. It's just all very, very shocking. At the same time, there appears to be a within Bakhmut itself, some of the military appears to be led by Western people, English-speaking people. I've come across a video. I've seen lots of videos of English-speaking soldiers recently retired from NATO armies just by chance. So it's not just chance. But I've seen them in Bakhmut, one particular video, which I'm going to show now, of a retreat with an injured soldier. And it's quite clear that the leader of this platoon is either Australian or possibly from London, but it sounds to me like he is Australian. We'll just have a quick look at this.
I'll put them in the corner right there.
Just
Они пиздец-то. Тем более перетянуто нормально. Берем, да, берем. Давай. Пацаны, на замену. Берем, брат. Все, сзади. Раз, два, три.
Alright, давай, let's go. Yeah, hold this. I'm gonna help the guys in the front. Keep down, boys, keep down. Alright, come on. Get him on, let's go.
So it's quite clear there that it's not Ukrainian soldiers running the show there. The person in charge appears to be Australian or maybe from New Zealand. What's your take on that, John?
With regard to foreign troops in Ukraine, a very interesting point was made by Colonel McGregor, a former advisor to the president, who said that there were 20,000 Polish troops in Ukraine. All they have to do is take off the uniform, go to Ukraine and put on another uniform. And it's not just the Poles. I mean, the whole thing is being run by the Americans and the British. The British because the Americans find them useful for doing their European work for them. Saves the Americans the bother of having to do that. But there are lots and lots of American, British, Canadian, Australian, the Five Eyes.
And they're still getting paid. They're still getting paid through the same sources, whether they were working for their own armies or not. It's still essentially NATO and American dollars that are paying their wages to be there.
Yes, I mean, the money that's been sent to Ukraine is paying for their soldiers, it's paying for their pensioners, it's paying for everything. You know, it was bad enough before the Americans got there, but by the time they leave, it'll be some mess. Any place they go to, from Afghanistan to Iraq to Syria to Libya. I mean, look at Libya. 130,000 we got last week coming in from Libya. And this is a major problem for Italy, for Malta, for all the countries around there who are experiencing it the most. And this is because Hillary Clinton wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. And the French wanted it.
And Libya is still in the thrusts of a civil war that nobody in the West is told about or knows about.
Oh, but the most important thing is that the oil companies are back. The French and British oil companies. That's the key point.
Yeah. We're going to stay on Bakhmut for another couple of minutes just to finish off that subject, John. The first video I want to show here is of General Syrskyi of the Ukrainian army, who for the third time in 10 days has visited Bakhmut to hand out medals. And to me, it's quite reminiscent of the fall of Berlin and generals being brought out, wheeled out to give medals to the desperate, to the dying, to the hopeless. And that's what Hitler and his henchmen did as Berlin was falling. And that's what appears to be happening now in Bakhmut as well. We'll look at that video, and then I just want to come back to something you mentioned about Zelensky's explanation of his position on Bakhmut. But we'll just have a look at this video quickly of General Syrskyi handing out medals first.
Так, хлопці, як настрій? Бойовий? Бойовий, правильно. Повинен бути супер бойовий, правильно? Всіх ворогів знищено, так? Так, точно. Тривогу здобудемо. Так, точно. А з такими героями, тому що героям слава йде вам слава. Тому що ви зараз там, де більше немає точки, яка більш гаряча, ніж треба. Тому я слухаю задоволений, вам сьогодні вручаю і хрести, і таку відзнаку, вона вперше сьогодні вручається. Це за звитягу, за доблесть, мужність, героїзм, відзнаку свободи.
And so in the jaws of defeat, they're handing out medals to encourage people to give their lives for what is a lost cause. Just this final video, I want to look at John and get your comments on it. Reports have been coming out, particularly over the last few months, that the military leadership in Ukraine have been urging Zelensky to pull out of Bakhmut, to not lose the men that are there, to not put more reserves in. And it would appear from what we're being told that Zelensky is adamant that Bakhmut is held, not to the last man anymore. He's moved slightly on that, but it's still to be held. Other Western media are saying now that Bakhmut is only symbolically important, but we all know that it was called the fortress by the Ukrainians themselves because it was the center of their defense of Ukraine and Donbass along the entire front line. Bakhmut was centrally important. Here is Zelensky now, just yesterday, now saying that there has been no disagreement and no discord between himself and his military commanders. And he's emphasizing this point so much that it makes me think the lady doth protest too much, methinks. He's actually gilding the lily here to try to impress the viewers, and it's more propaganda. Let's have a look at this.
Сьогодні на ставці я прямо поставив питання і командувачу Хортиці генералу Сирському, і главкому Залужному про те, якою вони бачать далі оборонну операцію на Бахмутському напрямку. Чи відійти, чи продовжувати оборону і посилюватися в місті. Обидва генерали відповіли не відходити і посилюватись. Ця позиція була одноголосно підтримана Ставкою. Інших позицій не було. Я сказав главкому знайти відповідні сили, щоб допомогти хлопцям у Бахмуті.
Zelensky is essentially saying that he's had no disagreement with any of his staff on holding Bakhmut, not only holding it, but reinforcing it, sending more people into what has become known as the meat grinder. What's your take on what Zelensky just said there?
Well, his position is moving, is constantly moving all the time. But what I found most interesting was the position that he's now in and that he has convinced his commanders to support is the one that obviously makes sense. They wouldn't have been there losing 11,000 men in February if it didn't matter. It matters because, as Zelensky said today, if they go past Bakhmut, it's an open road. So that's the precise reason why they're losing so many in Bakhmut, is because of that. All those massive defenses that they built along the front line, first, second, and third line defenses, most of the first and second line have been gone through already. So there's only a final line of defense. So when they get through that into Donetsk, they're in open space. So he's admitting that now, and he's admitting that's why they're losing so many men there. But if you think about it now, it really is fish in a barrel. The Ukrainians cannot get out of Bakhmut. Huge weapons are being lobbed in on top of them. They're in an appalling situation. I suspect that they will begin to leave fairly soon. Otherwise, they're in a dreadful situation where they will lose. The numbers that have been put in it have varied from 3,000 to 12,000 to above that. The Prigozhin, the Wagner leader, says that they're up to 20,000 in there. And might I also say that he made a very decent speech today where he was full of praise for the Ukrainian soldiers who were fighting in Bakhmut, their bravery, their resistance. He was full of praise for that. It was soldier to soldier, mano a mano. It was a lovely little touch.
And much of that resistance, John, I've seen a multitude of videos. And I have to say, as much as it might go against the grain of a lot of people's thoughts, I have to say that the video footage that I've seen of Russian soldiers putting their own lives at risk to give Ukrainian soldiers in the middle of a heated battle, to give them the opportunity to surrender, I just found so, I don't know what word, brave, heroic, humane. There was one particular video I saw now, it's over a month ago, of an individual Russian soldier approaching a trench in a forest outside Bakhmut. And rather than throw a grenade into the trench where he knew the Ukrainian soldiers were, he threw it in front of the trench to shock them. And he ran around the back of the trench. And there was 3 soldiers in the trench with guns. And they went to raise them. And their individual single Russian soldier grabbed the barrel of one of the guns and held him. And kept on asking them to surrender, to put their weapons down. And this went on for about 7 or 8 seconds, with gunfire, with bombs dropping all around them. And eventually one of the Ukrainian soldiers went to lift his gun to shoot him, and he was left with no choice but to shoot the 3 of them. And these are videos that are taken off helmet cameras. And I've seen instances and videos as well where Russian soldiers have defeated groups of Ukrainian soldiers and have tried to convince them to surrender. And the Ukrainian soldiers appear to have been told that the Russians will torture them and kill them or execute them immediately, which is clearly untrue. And the Russians sometimes spend significant periods of time under fire trying to convince these men that they're not going to be harmed, that they're going to get medical assistance, they're going to have a bed tonight, and they're going to be away from the battlefront. And sometimes I've seen videos that went on for 20, 25 minutes of this calming them down before you've convinced them, because they could just shoot them, but they don't. And so there's a lot of propaganda being put out there about the cruelties of this war. But in it, there's also humanity. And I've seen elements of humanity, irrespective of what the geopolitical drivers of this war want. Even on the battlefield, I've seen humanity. And I've seen as much humanity from the Russian side as any other side, if not more, to be honest with you. I don't want to create, say, one, human beings are all individuals and they should be judged on their individual merit. But the bravery on the one hand, I agree with, but also I've seen humanity and I've seen bravery that involved the non-killing, the attempts to get people to surrender so that they can survive. So that exists very much out there, and it's something that we're not being shown either.
No, it's not. And, they don't tell you about the information that they have, that they pass around the trenches. They can explode a little device that throws a lot of leaflets around the trenches, and they inform them of the procedure of how to surrender and what to expect, just to counteract all the stuff that they've been told. Because, if they believe they're going to get tortured, they're going to fight to the last man and all of that. And even if you look at the frontline Russian troops, their commanders have a serious responsibility not to lose their lives. They regard losing lives as a huge, what should I say, in the way that Ukraine, unfortunately, is throwing away thousands of lives. Russia does the reverse. BBC did an estimate of the Russian deaths, and they put it up to 20,000 deaths. You can talk about multiplying that by 10 at least for Ukraine. Now, the reason for that is that the Russians do care about the lives of their troops, and they don't believe in heroic defenses, that will get a great chapter in a history book. They believe in saving the lives of the men and not wasting them.
I've seen videos as well, it's very hard to confirm them, but of what appears to be Ukrainian rearguard troops of some sort executing their own soldiers if their soldiers refuse to fight. Now, it's very, very hard to confirm this, but
Yeah.
when I look at the balance of likelihood, when I add a lot of different things that I've seen and read together, there is a high possibility that that is actually happening.
Oh, there's no doubt about that. And you know, I'll give you an example. The other day I saw this uh, shot from the front where two Ukrainians had just been captured. They had their hands up, and one of the guys says to the Russian, he said, "Can I have a last cigarette?" And the Russian guy goes, "What are you talking about? You're going to be put into prison. That's about it. But we look after you." You know, that was shown straight. Now, I saw something else then yesterday of what looked like a Ukrainian soldier being shot by Russians. That's what it looked like. I'm not fully finished with reviewing that piece, but it struck me immediately that this is very like what the Russians showed, except the opposite.
Yeah.
It was trying to show the Russians as, you know, killers, and if you surrender to them, you'll be shot. So I thought that was interesting.
I've seen the video that you're talking about, and I wasn't convinced that it was Russians shooting a Ukrainian soldier. The evidence was not nearly high enough. There was no, so it was a video. All you saw was the guy standing in front of you. He seemed very calm. He almost seemed to know the people behind who had the gun behind the camera. It's really a helmet camera, so you couldn't see anybody except this guy. He looks quite casual. He's smoking as if maybe he doesn't even believe that they're going to do this. And then he gets shot. He says Slava Ukraine, and he gets shot. The context of the video, everything about it just does not feel right to me. It seems like a propaganda production. I can't say that 100%. All I can say is this: a man was shot in that video.
Yeah, the only piece of evidence you can really hope for is that his accent. You know, I'm just hoping that people who have seen that will be able to identify him.
Yeah.
And that will, you know, but there's not enough evidence in that particular short video to give you any indication of certainty.
What makes me particularly suspicious about it is its beginning point. It could have began 10 seconds early because there was clearly some kind of a conversation happened. It could have began 10 seconds earlier, but I believe that 10 seconds earlier would have revealed the perpetrators of what was a war crime.
Yeah.
And my own gut feeling on this is that was a Ukrainian soldier who refused to fight. And he was taken out by those old men. He was told to make statements. He refused to make them, or whatever the occurrence was, and they eventually shot him. That was my take. Now, I could be wrong on that, but the bottom line is it's been put out in Western media as these are Russians executing an unarmed Ukrainian POW, and there's absolutely no evidence for that within the video.
No, there's not.
Yeah. John, moving on to the further south of Bakhmut and slightly eastwards to the city.
Well, just before we finish there, Can I just make one point because it's relevant? And that is one of the greatest crimes involved in the whole Ukrainian imbroglio was the decision to change the history books to make them more anti-Russian 10 or more years ago, 20 years ago. And that was done by the United States and Britain as part of their preparation for this whole thing. Hating Russians and all things Russian is what they're being trained to do. So when somebody says to you, these people are horrible, hate them, and then say, here's a gun, kill them, it's much easier.
And we've seen that before, time and again in Europe over the last few centuries.
We've seen it in the past number of years where we've had with COVID, we've had people hating other people, even though some of the reasons they were hated are now known to be nonsense. I mean, the mask wearing was nonsense, yet people hated other people for wearing masks.
We just have to be
So
careful
we
what
went
we say
straight
here,
from
John.
there into hating Russia.
We just have to be careful what we say about COVID here, because we don't want this program to be taken off the social media channels.
Oh no, I know, but I'll tell you who I watch, and I'd recommend him to you if you're interested in the COVID thing, which is what's his name? Jimmy Dore.
Yeah.
Jimmy Dore is very good on COVID, and he knows exactly what he can and can't say. He's very good.
And Dr. John Campbell as well, who
Oh, he's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, he came out with that. It was him who showed the study that revealed that the masks made little or no difference, and different kinds of masks made little or no difference. And yet these were things we obsessed about hysterically and hated each other for it.
Yeah.
Isn't it madness?
It is madness. And we'll turn
You have to keep an eye on these bios.
Yeah, we'll turn to more madness now, John, because just quite a bit south of Bakhmut and slightly eastwards as well is the city of Donetsk, which is the capital really of the Donetsk region, and is probably the capital of the concept of autonomy and independence from Kiev for the people of former East Ukraine. There have been continuing attacks in that city now for months and months. There's no military objective, it would appear, to the attacks. You sent me a video from Donetsk about some houses that were bombed over the last few days. I want to show that video, and I also want to show a video from Eva Bartlett, who is an independent Canadian journalist living in Russia at the moment, and that visits Donetsk city regularly. And she's put out a report about grad rockets being used and being lobbed on top of civilian areas as well, with no military objective whatsoever by Ukraine's forces. Grad rockets that are given by the West and are being used to attack civilians, ultimately being used to attack civilians. We'll look at these two clips. We'll be back to you in a wee minute.
So I was just talking with a Channel 1 reporter that was here. So he was saying this is either a Grad or some other sort of missile. I don't know. It didn't land here. Somebody's placed it here. But it landed somewhere. Artema Boulevard is just over there. So it landed somewhere there. And yeah, it's like, as he was noting, a completely, obviously, residential area, as always, that Ukraine has shelled. So this is old. Somebody local said, no, this is old. Old, how old? I don't know. So I'm just going to see, there are a number of sites that were hit, so I will try to see what I can find that looks new. And I noticed some shattered glass. So I'm not sure where that missile rocket landed, but Здравствуйте. So this is Artema Street. And apparently there were some other hits along here. You can hear, by the way, Ukraine is shelling, I think, in Kyiv, which is to the north of here. They've already, city services have already cleaned up a lot of the mess.
And so if you look for Eva Bartlett on Twitter, I think she may be operating on YouTube and another number of other platforms as well. You'll be able to get that full video and many more factual, real life, non-propagandized reports from not only Donetsk, but the Donbass region itself. John, I know you've been watching the work of Eva Bartlett over the last while, and you wanted to talk tonight about the continuous bombing of Donetsk city, as well as the use of mines, which are disabling people right across the area. Do you want to fill us in on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's something that I'll mention every week until it's stopped, because what you have are daily war crimes, attacks on civilian targets in Donetsk every day. I mean, they do it because they're getting beaten on the front, so they take it out on the civilians. It's a kick the cat strategy. But unfortunately, the people who live in Donetsk since 2014, they have been enduring this. And I can't understand for a moment how they could live under that kind of pressure, but they did. And this is still happening every day. And not only that, but some of the bombs that they're dropping are butterfly bombs. They're little bomblets that would fit. You'd fit two of them in the palm of your hand. But the problem is you walk on them. There was a child badly injured yesterday after walking on one of them in Donetsk. Now, my point on this that I'd like to make to the Irish people is, since we somehow got involved with some partnership for peace, which is attached to NATO, we are now going to assist the Ukrainian army in demining. If we're going to help them with demining, can we not ask that they stop using butterfly bombs first?
And they're called butterfly bombs because they're quite attractive. Like, you see children, if they see one, just want to pick one up and play with it. It looks like a butterfly.
Yeah, it's like two wings on a central blobby thing. So when that's in grass near trees or there's leaves anywhere, you just can't see it.
And
I've tried to find them. I've seen examples of where they say, "Can you see anything in this photograph?" And I've killed myself and I couldn't see it. But then when it was pointed out, I mean, it was just impossible to discern what it was. But that's the intention, you see. That's the awful intention.
And the Irish government, John, we have agreed to
support the people who are doing this in their job. I think that's outrageous.
Yeah, could you go into a bit more detail on that, John, about what the Irish government have committed to Ukraine militarily in terms of mines?
From what I can see, they're aligned with the Partnership for Peace, which is like a second division NATO, where you work with NATO on different things, but you don't have the difficulty of having to join it. And unfortunately, as part of that process, we are now going to be involved training the Ukrainian army in demining, finding mines, how to take them up, all of that. But unfortunately, some of these mines will be those butterfly mines. How can we be involved in that?
And so basically, we're going to train Ukrainians, go over, and in a war situation, to maybe demine a field. Mines potentially planted by the Ukrainians originally, and they have to go into retreat now, and they have to lift different scenarios like that. Is that not direct involvement in conflict? Mining.
It's worse. It's worse. There is no difference between mining and demining. So essentially, they'll be showing them how to plant a mine.
That is worrying, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Yeah.
That's how we're being on this slippery slope that FFG have put us on. They've become too friendly with unelected leaders in Europe, who can then promise them nice little sinecures in Europe after they've finished. That's the unfortunate mess that we're in. And worse than that, you have Leo Varadkar, who was selected by the WEF to go on their training program. Now, nobody knows what this training program is. He doesn't say. When he goes to meetings of the WEF, he doesn't say. So this is very problematic to me.
And WEF and NATO, in some regards, appear synonymous. It's the same faces, the same leaders of the NATO countries that are linked into WEF. But one thing I did see today, John, was a video of Josep Borrell, who is essentially the EU's foreign minister. They call him an ambassador to something, but it is the EU foreign minister. And he was making a commitment for the European Peace Fund to take 1 billion out of it to pay for artillery for Ukraine. He said that this would speed it up. It would make it cheaper rather than individual countries in Europe doing it. They could buy in bulk. So that means that Ireland's contributions to the EU Peace Fund is being used to pay for artillery, for missiles to kill people.
Yeah. And pensions for Nazis.
And pensions for Nazis. John, I'm going to finish up with one story. I'm not going to tell you what it is until I show you the BBC headline, and you give me your reaction, but try not to laugh too much. Here's the headline. Ukraine war, Russian reservists fighting with shovels, UK Defence Ministry. Russian reservists are likely using shovels for hand-to-hand combat in Ukraine due to a shortage of ammunition, the UK's Ministry for Defence says. What's your take on that?
Well, in a war, that's clown world. That is absolute, utter nonsense. They're lying to people, and everybody knows they're lying to people. Peace is war. War is peace. You can't believe these people at all. I wouldn't trust Borrell as far as I would throw him. I mean, they call him the High Commissioner for Foreign Relations. It's some ridiculous title. Sounds like he's in the Raj, India or something, you know, and he has that mindset as well.
The garden
and the jungle.
Yeah. And every infantryman in any modern army is issued with a shovel so that they can dig a foxhole if they're on the advance or the retreat. And that's what the purpose of the foldable shovel is. And so the BBC took this image. Apparently it came out originally from one of the Ukrainian ministries, which it might as well, as you said, be coming out from the center of the circus tent. And the BBC were willing to run with this, just like they were willing to run with the story of the Ghost of Kiev, just like they were willing to show clips from a Star Wars movie, and they're at the beginning of this war and claiming it to be Ukraine. Do they have any shame left, John?
Well, one of the keys to understanding Ukraine is, once you know that Ukraine is fighting a PR war. For example, when there's after Bakhmut, you can be sure that some extravagant scene will be prepared to take people's mind off the fact that they've lost Bakhmut. That's the way they operate. I mean, from the very beginning, you know, and also in Bucha, Kramatorsk, all of these places where they went, it's information warfare. In other words, lies.
It's a bit like the human rights representative, the Ukrainian human rights, Denisova, I think her name was. And she was putting out stories about mass rape and sexual abuse of women, of children by the Russian army, as though it's some organized thing in the Russian army. Turns out she was caught out because international organizations that support women who have been sexually abused wanted to go and meet the victims. And that's when it became a problem, because there were no victims to meet. The Ukrainian Rada had to fire her publicly and pretend that this was a once-off, when in reality, it is de rigueur, it appears to me, de rigueur, if you're in the Ukrainian government, that you have to come out with the most exaggerated stories possible.
But that's what they call it themselves. They call it themselves the information war, but the Western press never refers to that. But they call it that themselves. I mean, Denisova, it wasn't just she was making up rape stories, but she was talking about they were raping little boys and little girls and all of this. All of it completely made up between her and her daughter. And unfortunately, the downside of that was the Russian ambassador getting savaged on RTE radio and RTE television, and being treated very unprofessionally because of lies.
And I think the RT's approach to interviewing the Russian ambassador and the absolute mistreatment of him, it really put Ireland in a very negative position for now and into the future. Because at some point, this war is going to come to an end. And at some point, there has to be some type of a rapprochement. And Ireland has sullied itself so much that we are as bad as any of the other propagandist countries, NATO countries. We've sullied our vests so much in this regard that we've actually put ourselves into the bad boy corner as much as anybody else when there was absolutely no need for it.
Yeah, and not only there on the Ukraine one, but also, I mean, we've lost friends in Africa. You know, the Ethiopians aren't talking to us now because of a row the Irish representative Coveney got into with them. The image of Ireland as a small country that was horrifically abused by its larger neighbor and who was, you know, surviving that episode is taking a bit of a blow. But they're making the biggest mistake of their lives. Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael are making the biggest mistake of their lives by interfering with Ireland's neutrality. And I think they'll pay heavily for it at the next election.
Well, I hope so. And I shouldn't give out opinion on this, but I hope so. John, we're going to close up for this evening and for this week. Is there anything you'd like to close up with?
Yeah, the only other thing was that you have all the protests in Europe, and they're starting in America as well. And but you're also finding that the newspapers that are doing polls are showing huge falls in support for military action in Ukraine everywhere, Europe and the United States. In France, it's down to 20%, Germany, 40%. In the UK, 45%. It's falling. Support for this thing is falling. And because from start to finish, one side was playing information politics, and they were playing it with people's lives. And if I can just get back to those poor bastards in those trenches, in Bakhmut, in Crimea, in Avdiivka, all of those, tonight they'll be under the most ferocious bombardment of all kinds of missiles. And there is one new thing that they're facing. Recently, the Russians, having damaged so much of Ukraine's defenses, are now beginning to use bombers more. And they're using bombers on Bakhmut and on Avdiivka. This is new. Now you're talking about the difference between 150 kilos to 1,500 falling from a plane. Now, if you're in a trench, you know, within anywhere near that, and that's only one bomb.
And all these
Think of those poor guys.
All these young men,
yeah,
just thinking about home, probably in the freezing cold, in the mud, in the snow and ice.
Thinking of their girlfriends, you know, thinking about going out with their mates, the things that young people do, and old men are making them die in trenches. Yeah. That to me is the biggest crime of all.
Yeah. And it doesn't look like it's going to be an end to it soon.
No.
John Moran, thanks for joining us again for what is a fulsome update of what's happening in Ukraine, a balanced update without any of the usual propaganda and bias. We'll see you again next week, John. Thanks for coming by.
Thank you, Finbar. Bye-bye.